So, we're gonna start with an apology. If you are wondering what a strange podcast is doing in your podcast app, this is not a U2 thing. Nobody reached out of the ether and forced your phone to subscribe to something that you do not want to hear. I assure you, you do want to hear this, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is, you subscribe to this of your own accord. It was called Me and the Dog up until today, and it was me, Ev Buckley, and the dog, Lupo, talking about the issues of the day. And we would do that while wandering around the parks and byways of Glasgow. But for a number of reasons, not limited to the fact that we don't wander around for no reason anymore, we have decided to take this into the studio, rebrand it, and make it a little bit more professional and polished as we do so. Now it's called Ev on Everything. And if you are new to the podcast, welcome. It's going to be a lot of fun for the old listeners who are coming over from Me and the Dog, and for you, the new listeners. Today's episode is going to be all about the effects on animals of the shutdown or the lockdown that we've had to undergo in order to deal with the novel coronavirus. Okay, lots of developments have been happening in the animal world. You've probably seen a bunch of stuff on social media and around the place about the effect on animals in our cities and in the countryside and so on. And we're going to cover as well some of the effects of human efforts to conserve animals at all, COVID-19 aside. And we're going to talk about externalities, which are some of the favorite things of market economists and capitalists because they save them a lot of money, and a lot of things that happen to animals are externalities. And by the end of the show, we'll have covered how those externalities have been exposed. All right. So it is Ev on Everything, and you are welcome. Thank you so much for grabbing a hold of this podcast, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. We all like peace and quiet. Some of us like it more than others do, but most of us to some extent would like to be left alone without being interfered with by other people to get on with whatever it is that we get on with. Pandas are a lot like that. You see, they have life worked out. Or at least they had until we came along and wrecked everything the way we normally do. They just like to exist. They live the contemplative life like a fuzzy, playful Aristotle. Or if you prefer, they're just lazy and they enjoy one of the easiest hands ever dealt by evolution. Again, until we came along. Whatever's going on in their adorable, variegated heads is more important than anything. They sit there, they eat, they think. Whatever's going on in there is more important even than sex. They do just enough of that to get by and no more. Which humanity could probably learn from, in fairness. I think we have maybe the wrong end of the continuum of how much obsession with sex is a good idea. We, of course, very much get in the pandas' way when they try to live their contemplative lives, like we do with everything. They're often thought to be mountain-dwelling and remote, kind of like gorillas. They're not. We made them that way. Now we live where they used to live. They used to live across southeast China into northern Vietnam and Myanmar, but no longer. Now they're confined to tiny stretches of uplands, mostly in Sichuan, And they are in serious trouble because they don't have enough habitat left to survive by themselves. They're more fertile than people think. They have this reputation that they're so terrible at reproducing that they were going to go extinct anyway all by themselves. That's not true. They actually have baby pandas about every 2 years for about 15 years of fertile life if they're left unbothered. And that's not bad as families go. You know, an Irish Catholic family would be happy with 6 or 7 kids. Half the time it's twins, and the weaker twin is left to starve and die, which is an improvement from Ireland. That's where I'm from, by the way. There in Ireland, the weaker twin traditionally goes into the priesthood or maybe post-leaving certificate education, I don't know. Still though, with nowhere for the pandas to live, we took them into zoos in a big way. And we were shocked when they wouldn't mate. Which is a bit like being shocked that a human might prefer not to start a family in prison with a total stranger. I mean, we were amazed. In fairness, most animals breed relatively well in captivity. You know, they answer the call of their hormones and evolution, and they do what they need to do to make more of their species. Pandas, less bothered about that than other species might be. But recently, 2 pandas mated naturally in a zoo in Hong Kong. Pandas used to be given as gifts to overseas nations, or to former colonial possessions with worrying ideas about human rights in this case. They used to be given for decades, but latterly China worked out that they could charge people to take on the expense of saving the species that they themselves were strangling out of its home ecology, and they could look good while doing it. So that's what they did. You now have to pay China to have pandas in your zoo, and it's like £1 million a year. It is not cheap. And then you have to handle all the panda stuff yourself. Pandas, though, being very sensible creatures, were reluctant to bring children into a never-ending nightmare panopticon. Getting them to reproduce was actually difficult. Humans, not being sensible creatures, decided that constantly bothering the pandas was the way to get them in the mood. They dressed in panda suits. They gave them Viagra and IVF. They played them panda porn because panda problems apparently are just identical to human problems. Surprisingly, didn't usually work. Then, a genius had the inspired idea to stop having 1,000 small children gawk at them all day long, dripping ice cream over their hands and throwing occasional exhaustion tantrums. They realized maybe, that's not the best environment for quite a secretive animal to be comfortable enough to start a family. Well, it was less an idea, and it was more a catastrophic consequence of rapacious, unbridled capitalism distorting the natural world so drastically that it became a finely tuned incubator of virus-borne death. COVID-19 closed the zoos. And in the calm and quiet, the pandas decided that this is probably as good as it's going to get in terms of the contemplative life. After a decade of trying and failing to make this mating thing work, they finally got it together exactly at the time that we finally got out of their way. Not a surprising development when you think about it in common sense terms, right? And there is a wider lesson here. If we just get out of the way of a lot of wildlife, just pull ourselves out of their habitats and ecologies, they will get on with what they need to save themselves quite happily by themselves. A lot of this interventionist conservation has a lot to do with the fact that we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to keep doing what we are doing. We want to keep being the way we're being that's causing all this damage, and then we want to artificially repair the damage so we don't have to feel bad about causing it in the first place. And that leads to stuff like captive breeding programs, right? There's nothing wrong with a captive breeding program per se, especially if it's necessary to repopulate a species. But there's a lot wrong with relying on a captive breeding program when what really needs to be done is for us to take our foot off the neck of the species in question and just leave them alone. And the panda is the perfect example of this, because panda conservation is ridiculously expensive. You know, aside from paying the Chinese government so much just to be allowed to do it, it is really, really expensive to do. I mean, all humane and above board animal husbandry in zoos of usually wild animals is an expensive thing. You know, gone are the days, thankfully, when we lock animals up in tiny cages and, gawk at them with ice cream running over our hands, I suppose. Most modern zoos tend to be very humane places for animals to be. Not always. And there's always the idea that animals' habitats range very, very far beyond the size of the average zoo enclosure, right? But at the same time, you balance that against the idea that a lot of animals are, their life in their home habitat might not be as nice to them as life in a zoo. And we don't often know, sometimes we know very well, but we don't often know how psychologically affected an animal will be by captivity, right? Some will be seriously affected and some won't, right? Some are a lot happier when they can perceive how safe they are in their enclosure, safe from predators and so on. Others will be distraught by the fact that they can't move around. Others will be distraught again by the idea that they can't get to things that are outside the enclosure. And sometimes we understand this very well, sometimes we don't. But fundamentally, striking that balance and keeping it is an expensive thing to do. And we spend a lot of money on pandas. Some people think we spend far, far too much money on pandas. It runs into the millions and millions every year. As I said, it costs you £1 million a year to have a panda. You have to pay that to China just to have them. And then you put all of the research effort in, you run all the labs and the experiments and therapies and everything just to try to get these things to breed. Once they've bred, what do you do with them? Keep them in zoos even longer, I suppose, because you can't put them back in China. There's already pandas in the small habitats that they have available to them in China. And China is not ready to be, creating whole new nature reserves where they're going to have to stop their economic development in favor of reintroducing pandas to places they used to be. Certainly, if you get a dozen new pandas, you get a dozen new pandas for zoos, right? And that costs a huge, huge amount of money. Some people think far too much. So even if this is only an illustration, even if this is not really scientifically valid, two pandas decided to have sex at a time when they weren't being bothered by the public. Could be a coincidence. It's their mating time of year anyway, and it's been historically difficult to get them to mate in captivity, so one successful go at it in 10 years might not be such a strange situation to be in, right? Maybe it's just an illustration, but it's an illustration of a very, very good principle. And that principle is that getting out of animals' ways in order to allow them to do their own thing is at the root of any successful conservation effort. It's true that sometimes you need to intervene a little bit if you want to, say, reintroduce eagles to Scotland, which is where I'm recording this. You do have to bring eagles there. You have to get them from somewhere. You have to raise them in captivity until they're old enough to fend for themselves, and you have to release them in the right place. Then you need to protect them because people will kill them. You know, people will deliberately poison and shoot eagles because there's a financial consequence to some people of having eagles around. Now, the government will put in place programs that say, look, if you lose a lamb to an eagle, we'll pay you for the lamb. All right? But not every farmer can collect on that or will. And sometimes the lamb just vanishes, you know? Sometimes the eagle will literally fly off with it if it's a small enough lamb. Not usually. Okay, if they take large prey, like a lamb, they're probably going to eat that on the ground where they find it and leave the carcass for the farmer. But sometimes eagles will fly off with, their prey. And maybe the farmer doesn't always get that compensation, right? So they don't like it. And it's been known to happen that they will shoot the eagles instead of let this happen. Even worse than that is gamekeepers who don't like having any birds of prey around because it interferes with the breeding of game birds. Now, it's not as simple as just killing, okay? There are tens of thousands of game birds on properly managed, well, I say properly managed for the people who want to shoot them for money, okay, on a game reserve. Okay, so if you've got a shooting estate, it's going to have a lot of grouse and a lot of partridge and all that, okay? Eagles are not going to be able to eat enough of them to make any dent because there's only going to be a couple of eagles per, entire grouse hunt. And that's probably pushing it a bit. There's probably less than that. But what does happen is having predators around like that affects whether the grouse stay in the same place or not. Okay, so you've raised all these grouse and they're on your shooting estate. And then some birds of prey set up shop there because there's loads of free food. What if the grouse leave? What if there's only hiding places from a hawk or an eagle or a hen harrier or whatever it is for a small number of grouse and the rest of them feel exposed, feel under pressure or under threat? They're going to fly away. That's what birds do. Okay? And if they do that, they're not on your estate anymore. You don't get to sell the opportunity to kill them. So, grouse estate management, they don't usually like having birds of prey around. And again, they have been killed by poison, by traps, and by shooting in the past. So, yeah, sometimes you need this interventionist kind of approach. Sometimes you've got to have a thumb on the scales, otherwise something goes very wrong, okay? But it's probably kind of important to the point I'm making that the things that are going wrong here are human interventions in themselves, right? We're not talking about random other animals interfering with the eagles. They're eagles. Things don't really interfere with eagles. Eagles take care of themselves. But people interfere with eagles and people need to stay out of it to give the eagles a good chance, right? Still, we do have to move them, we do have to raise them, we do have to install them in the right place. Then we track them to see what's going on, and a lot of this conservation activity is really valuable. But fundamentally, they need to be left alone. And in a moment, we're going to talk about a much more profound example of this. An extinct mammal that was basically harried and interfered with out of existence by human activity in the face of efforts to conserve it while people were trying desperately to save it by intervention. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So, yeah, you are listening to Ev on Everything, the new, improved, upgraded, and rebranded version of me and the dog, which you may have been subscribed to before. If you're still listening, thank you so much for listening through the me and the dog months while we got this thing off the ground. But now we're spreading our wings and expanding into the universe of Ev on Everything. We hope you're enjoying the show so far. If you are, I want you to let me know on Twitter at Ev Buckley. That's where you can find me. And you find the show itself on social media of all kinds at Ev on Everything. That's on Twitter, it's on Facebook, it's on Instagram, and so on. Any sort of feedback is hugely well received. We love hearing that people are out there listening. We know you're out there listening. We see you in the stats. But hearing about it directly really brightens my day, so let me know. If you can, I want you to do the podcast dance. I want you to give it 5 stars. I want you to like it. I want you to share it. Give it a review if you can. Okay? Wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts, just tap on the I approve of this podcast mechanism, whatever it happens to be. Because if you do that, more people will listen, and if more people listen, it will snowball. We already know that there are people listening all over the world. We see them in the stats. But if you share this to other people, I can keep doing it, because if I can show that people are listening, I can make a small amount of money out of this. I'm never going to get rich off it, but I can keep doing it indefinitely if you help me out. So everybody wins if you just hit that 5-star thing, or give it a quick review, share it to your mates, tell people to listen, and so on. As I said, thank you so much for listening so far, and I don't really want to keep you any longer than is necessary with this self-promotion jazz, so let's get back to the animals and why we should just get over ourselves and leave them alone. So, if you believe what you read on Twitter, and the state of the current political situation says a lot of people do believe what they read on Twitter, Venice is undergoing a phoenix-like rebirth right now. Now that we aren't stomping its wildlife into the mud at the bottom of the lagoon, it is blossoming into some sort of more natural, more appropriate, more correct expression of the wildlife that should be living there. Dolphins are back, according to Twitter, and swans. I'm pretty sure I saw a tweet where there was a giant salamander in a Venetian canal. I'm gonna guess that was probably mislabeled from an area where giant salamanders actually exist. But, somebody's trying. People are basically saying Venice is better off now that you can see through the water. All right? Sadly, it's not true. These animals, salamanders notwithstanding, are local to the Adriatic. They were never really not there. Okay? It's not weird to see dolphins in harbors in the Adriatic. Okay? It's not strange to see swans in the bywaters of Venice. Neither of those things actually took place in Venice proper, by the way. One of them, the swans were on an island near Venice, and the dolphins were all the way over on the other side of the Adriatic in Sardinia. So, yeah, not true or accurate. It's nice that people are excited about this, all right? It's nice that people, when they see these tweets and these photos, they really get into it. They're like, this is awesome. Venice has got its wildlife back. It never really lost the wildlife, okay? But what's important is the water is suddenly clear now. Okay? You can see through it. Light can pass through it. It used to be churned up constantly by motorboat traffic, right? It used to be completely opaque, mud particles suspended in it, not to mention other kinds of pollution, okay? Were making the water into some kind of muddy, silty, choked up morass, okay? And suddenly having no mud suspended in the water means the canals can now suddenly become much, much more healthy. Okay? It's true that people are seeing fish in them that they couldn't see before, and some of those fish will probably have come into areas of the canals that they wouldn't have been in before because the low light or the high silt levels would have kept them out, right? But it's a bit soon for a massive change like that. Okay. Light does lead to more photosynthesis in the water. More photosynthesis from plants in the water oxygenates the water, and that allows fish to breathe more easily. And it also obviously provides food. Okay. So those swans eat plants that grow in the water, and the more plant growth there is, the happier the swans are. The mud was like water smog. It was blinding and choking, and it made it very hard for plants or fish to even exist in the canals. But the fact is, the ones that are being seen there now were probably there all along anyway. Okay? But now that the silt and the mud is gone, the water's clear. It's unnaturally clear, in fact. Okay? It's unnaturally clear because nothing was growing there while it was choked up with mud. Okay. In a lot of these photos, you can see clear down to the bottom of the canal, and there is nothing there. There's just sandy mud settled at the bottom now instead of suspended in the water, and there's no plant life. The clearest water has nothing at all alive in it. And you can put that inspirational quotation on an Instagram post. Just don't mention me. Clear water has nothing in it. Nothing in it means there's nothing alive. Okay. So when you see, a tropical lagoon with perfectly clear white sand all at the bottom of it for miles and crystal clear water that makes it look like the boats in it are suspended in midair, that water's dead. Give or take microorganisms and things like that. That's not what I mean. Healthy water, like a healthy pond full of life, has tons of stuff in it. It has like frog spawn and stuff. It's got seaweed. It's got tiny little fish. It's got krill and plankton and little crustaceans and all kinds of stuff, right? So, no, Venice didn't suddenly become an ecological paradise overnight just because people stopped churning up the water. But even if dolphins didn't magically appear in Venice, they can definitely very suddenly disappear. So there's this creature, or there was this creature called a baiji. Okay, a baiji was or is a freshwater dolphin that lived in the Yangtze River in China. Coincidentally, it lived right alongside Wuhan, of all places, which is kind of topical. But in the Yangtze River, there were these dolphins. They're quite big for aquatic or, a freshwater dolphin. They're the size of a person. And it was the subject of all the usual depredations that humanity visits on animals, right? It was fished itself. It was fished as bycatch. It was hunted. It was a victim of electrofishing, like electrocuting all of the wildlife in stretches of water to kill it and then harvesting it when it floats to the surface. It was a victim of habitat loss as people just built more and more stuff on and around the river. Okay? All these things happened to baiji for decades. Okay? Now, initially, many, many years ago, baiji would have been I mean, you get this kind of anthropological point of view sometimes where people say, oh, the Baiji were venerated by the locals, they were seen as protected, magical, whatever. And it's a problematic point of view, obviously, because it assumes this kind of noble savage sort of a thing going on in China, which is really, really shaky ground, right? Pretty sure 20th century Chinese people knew what a dolphin was, didn't think it was a magical river spirit, and while there may have been social taboos against killing them, I don't think it's safe to say that, they were 100% left alone at all times because the folk knowledge of them said never to touch them. Maybe it did. I don't know. I'm no China expert. Okay. But certainly in the 50s onwards, after the kind of communists took over, that sort of cultural memory was suppressed deliberately. Okay. The Cultural Revolution happened, and old Chinese traditions were squashed in favor of modern dynamic communism, right? And it was open season then on the Baiji. They were hunted, they were trapped, and they were killed wholesale. Now, after that Cultural Revolution period had passed, it became clear that these dolphins were in trouble, right? And the Chinese government started to try to protect them. And the usual measures were used, protected reserves, fishing regulation, captive breeding, all that usual stuff. Okay? And on they went. The reason that I mention the Baiji isn't solely because they are endangered. It's also not solely because they were protected or even because they're related to Venice that we mentioned before in terms of being aquatic mammals trying to live cheek by jowl with modern urban humanity. It's that the Yangtze River is so opaque, even without any human interference. It's basically very similar to the way that the Venetian canals would have been. Okay? There's a lot of silt, there's a lot of mud, there's also a lot of human interference. On top of that, it's highly polluted. Okay? It's been said that it discharges more plastic pollution into the water than any other river in the world. It's had a huge number of its natural lakes and tributaries and so on dammed off away from it. And they've dried up. And of course, it's got the immense Three Gorges Dam halfway along it, splitting it in two. So it's not necessarily the most friendly place for any wildlife to live any longer. And what's happened is the Baiji have slowly dwindled away essentially to extinction, functionally. We don't know that they're extinct, but we can't find any, and we haven't been able to in a good 15 years. Okay? Now, to work out why this is, it's important to look at what's actually going on with the dolphins as they try to exist. It's true that, yes, they were often hunted, they were often killed as bycatch, there were boat strikes, and so on. But at the same time, they were trying to be saved. People were trying to conserve them. And it wasn't working. Okay? Nature reserves didn't work. Controls on human behavior didn't work. They just would not bounce back no matter what was tried. Okay? Now, we need to go on a little tangent here for a moment. Okay? We need to go back 20 years to September 11th. Because one of the things that happened on September 11th was everything stopped. Okay? Kind of similar to what's happening to us right now, but what's happening right now is slower. It was very abrupt on September 11th. Aircraft groundings were obviously the most notable thing to happen, but a lot of people don't realize that all of the shipping stopped as well. Okay? And ships, though it might not be obvious from the surface, are loud. I remember taking car ferries over to France when I was a kid, from Ireland to France, overnight ferries. And the cabins in the bowels of the ship, they're tiny and cramped, and every single surface is vibrating all night. It's vibrating and tossing over and back ceaselessly. The engines in the ship were powerful enough to shake every single surface in this giant vessel. They're powered by these immense two-stroke diesels. And it's basically like a scaled-up version of the generator powering the lights at a music festival campsite, okay? They're huge, they're slow, they're highly energy efficient, although they are very polluting. And they're very, very noisy. And there are lots of huge ships out there, okay? A fully loaded aircraft carrier is a bit shy of a 95 kilotons, about 100,000 tons, right? A cruise liner these days is bigger than that, over 100,000 tons. Okay? You can imagine the size of the engines they need to move that kind of thing, way bigger than a car ferry. And they're the same engines with the same vibration, the same noise. Okay? Against the fear that one of those engines could power its ship directly into a city centre port, they were all stopped after September 11th. And overnight, almost all of the noise in the sea vanished. The water was suddenly quiet. Okay? A study that was going on right at that time into right whales found a drop in their stress hormones overnight. Okay? Now, we can't read too much into that. It was a study that was going on about something else and just so happened to record some data that indicated that suspiciously, right when September 11th happened, the whales' stress levels suddenly dropped. Okay? The way that they measure it through analysis of feces has been shown in other animals to show the same thing. Okay? They're not making it up. They saw it happen, though it hasn't been double-blind tested for obvious reasons, because we don't like stopping all international shipping travel just to check out a scientific hypothesis about whales, right? But it was the first time since the advent of the propeller screw that the oceans had been properly quiet. Now, right whale songs have increased in pitch by about an octave since the 1950s. Okay? Higher pitched sounds die out more quickly in the water. They don't reach as far as they could, so the whales can't communicate as far. And the same is true for echolocation. Okay? So if you're using echolocation as an animal, you don't want the background to be noisy for really obvious reasons. It's like being blinded. Okay? The lower pitched original whale songs of right whales carried 20 times as far as the new higher pitched ones. Cetaceans did not like the noise. That's clear. Okay? They changed their songs to avoid it. Their stress levels dropped when it was taken away. They did not like it at all. They had to live around it. They had to adjust themselves to get by while it was going on. And the Baiji were in a cauldron of noise. Okay? They're basically sight blind anyway. Okay? They don't have good vision because it's not very useful in the big silty river. Okay? But on top of all the fishing and the boat strikes and the pollution and everything else, we were drowning out their primary communication and hunting strategies with the noise of these ships moving up and down the river. Okay? The conservation efforts failed. The Baiji are gone. There's some hope. Yangtze is a very, very big river. is hard to survey. Okay? But it's not much hope. They needed us to leave them alone. And we didn't, and they're gone. And all our efforts to conserve them failed because fundamentally there was nowhere to conserve them to. Didn't matter if we cordoned off parts of the river and said no fishing here, no boat strikes in here, if we were still blasting the whole place acoustically from ship engines, right? Didn't matter if we were, trying to breed them in captivity and release them, if the rest of the river is being subjected to all of this depredation. Therefore, the ecology that they're trying to live in is severely degraded. They can handle the part where they breed and reproduce themselves. They need us to get out of their way and let them do it. So don't be too cynical, right? About swans and fish in clear water in Venice, or dolphins or whatever it is. I know people were wrong about them, okay? It wasn't necessarily true that dolphins had suddenly materialized in the middle of Venice. But it's an indication, okay? They may not have been gone in the past just because Venice had some poor water quality. But they will be in future, like the Baiji, if we don't learn from this. If we don't spot that the things that we are doing to the natural world are having such a profound, massive effect on it. It is not enough to just, try to put a plaster over the wounds that we are doing to the ecology of the world. It's not enough to fix the problems after we make them. We need to stop making them. And we can stop making them. It's not that hard to do because we're doing it right now. As soon as it became useful for us to stop interfering with the natural world just by getting out of the way and stomping all over it every time we wanted to go anywhere or do anything, as soon as it became good for us, we just did it. And what we've proved now is that we can do it. We can stay out of their way if we see it as being useful to us to do so. And that's the big lesson that we need to take away from this. When everything returns to normal, and it will return to normal, there's a huge amount of money behind it returning to normal, so it's going to. Okay? They're going to write down all the lessons that we learned. And, if you're as cynical as I am, you're probably thinking, yep, they're going to write them all down. They're not going to do anything about any of them. And that is probably true. But one of the lessons that we need to learn is that we finally showed ourselves how good it can be just to stay out of the way of things. Let them take their course. Little bit of a thumb on the scales occasionally just to make sure things turn out okay. But fundamentally, leave the animals alone and it should be all right. Anyway, this is not the only way that animals have been affected by the COVID-19 crisis, right? It's not just wildlife kind of being usually stomped on by us and suddenly not being. Okay? There's more to it. It's generally accepted that COVID-19 itself came from wildlife. Yeah, so I mentioned back in the panda section of the show that COVID-19 could be seen as a consequence of unbridled capitalism. Why? Are viruses encouraged by climbing stock markets? Do novel financial instruments lead to novel strains of SARS? Kind of. Indirectly. Okay, no. But capitalism as a whole? Yes, definitely yes. In its simplest form, market forces drive towards efficiency of some kind. Normally, it's found to be efficient, for instance, to drastically underpay employees. Another very efficient approach to business is to be bailed out by governments when things go wrong. Expropriating natural resources from impoverished countries is very, very efficient. All of these things give rise to horrific consequences for people, right? And for the natural world. But those are easily filed away in a very useful category. They're called externalities. An externality is a nice way of saying something is an expense not paid for by the company, which itself is a nicer way of phrasing the idea of consequences to somebody who doesn't benefit from the activity that led to it. When they built Chernobyl, they didn't budget for a giant swathe of Ukraine left uninhabitable for generations, nor for all the cancers all over Europe. And when those things happened, they didn't pay for them then either. They were external to the business of energy generation. Capitalism loves externalities. They are super efficient. Well, SARS CoV2 is an externality. All they wanted was to run a wet market, or loads and loads and loads of wet markets, because it's easy to keep meat fresh when it's still alive. You stack it in tiny little cages and it's breathing and bleeding and pissing all over each other, and generally being a giant disease churn, frothing up new virus variants over and over. Then you add intensive meat farms with millions of animals penned together with no freedom to move, no way to distance from each other, right? A lot of these wild animals for meat markets are taken from the wild and then they're just bred in captivity in giant meat factory farms, right? Then you add bats, probably bats, that's what they think, hosting coronaviruses in the wild and flying out nightly to potentially infect and interact with these seas of animals. And finally, you take all those COVID nurturing animals and you rub them all over people working in the wet markets. All that suffering of animals, all that disease and disease in humans, externalities. No need to worry. We created an economy that is literally incapable of putting a cash price on that stuff. Therefore, economically, it doesn't exist. The animal suffering can't have a price tag attached to it, so it doesn't exist. Infecting humans with diseases can't have a price tag put on it, doesn't exist. Giving rise to whole new strains of viruses, no price tag. Economically, it doesn't exist. The missed work of the sick people exists on an individual level, of course, but they can be fired and replaced. So that doesn't really count. But now, one of those externalities just woke up and stamped on the world economy like an American border guard stamping on an asylum seeker's passport. And shockingly, China woke up and China did something. It banned trade in wild animals for human consumption. Now, it remains to be seen if the ban will work, okay? And there's already naysayers coming out and going, oh, it wasn't the wet markets. You can't blame it on that. Oh, it'll just all go underground and then we won't be able to control it. There's always naysayers, but this is a huge start. China, the most populous country on earth with the most massive wild animal food industry, has just passed legislation designed to leave animals alone. It's designed to let them live and get on with their lives in peace without people interfering with them. Now, they only did it out of self-interest, economic self-interest. The people didn't matter. The disease didn't matter. The animals didn't matter. All this was going on in December in China, and they didn't do anything back then when it was just people, when it was just animals, when it was just a new virus. But when the economy got knocked flat, then they went, hang on a second. We got to do something about this. And what they did was instruct people with the force of law not to be interfering with wild animals just so they can eat them. Don't trap them, don't take them out of the wild, don't factory farm them, don't stack them up in tiny little cages in wet markets, and definitely don't sell them as food. So to come full circle here and wind up the episode, what they're doing is what we should all be doing if we want to conserve these species, right? If we want animals to survive and thrive, coronavirus in many different ways is teaching us how to do it, because we didn't have the resolve as an economy, as a society, as nations. We didn't have the resolve to do it ourselves. We never shut down an economy because it was bad for the environment. But when we got an economy shut down for us, we realized it was good for the environment. We never accepted that we had to change fundamentally in order to save ecologies, in order to save habitats. We kept telling ourselves we could do it if we just made the effort. We could intervene in these things and fix them somehow. We could make new habitats. We could make new breeding and reintroduction programs. We could find ways to keep doing what we were doing and still save all of that wildlife. It was never true. We were never going to be able to achieve what we needed to save all of these species unless we were willing to change ourselves. Now we're being stared in the face by the evidence that not only does this work, but we can do it. It's not impossible. They were saying it's impossible because they stood to lose tons of money. They stood to lose their place in the pecking order of the world economy. They stood to lose their buying power. They stood to lose their balance of payments, whatever it was. All this economic stuff that was unthinkable just happened to us anyway. And we had to do it, and we had to put up with the consequences. And shockingly enough, we're surviving the consequences. Things are pretty okay. Society hasn't collapsed. But when we got out of the way of the animals, they showed us that they can get on just fine without us. Anyway, you have been listening to Ev on Everything, which I really hope you enjoyed. You're still listening after an hour, so I'm going to guess you probably at least tolerated it. And, that's not bad. Find me on Twitter at Ev Buckley. Let me know what you thought. Or find the show at Ev on Everything, everywhere that you find stuff on social media. And again, get those likes and ratings and stars and whatever in there, because that helps. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a great first episode of Ev on Everything. I hope you agree. And the next one is coming on Friday, unless anything goes terribly wrong. Watch out for that in your podcast app. Tell everyone you know how awesome this thing is and that they should go and listen to it too. Thanks again. Thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye.